I first want to thank Matt Thurlow and the staff of the Decorative Arts Trust for their wonderful support in contributing to my dissertation research and project. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the ancestral lands in New York of the Lenni Lenape, whom I thank for their stewardship, both past and ongoing. Oops, there it is. For an 1875 fancy dress ball at Delmonico's, the space would have glimmered with the Gilded Age elite. It was a mixture of historical ensembles, satin, and diamonds. In this New York ballroom, one guest included Mary Minnie Stevens, who donned an elaborate Egyptian-inspired costume. Black silk and gold jewelry brushing up against her ivory skin, Stevens takes up the complicated figure of Cleopatra. Dressed in a pharaoh's headdress, or nemes, she posed in a hybrid 1870s gown of Egyptian revival motifs. A medley of gold satin, black trim, and woven lame wrapped around her skirt. And applique hieroglyphs also appeared down the front of the gown. And finally, small gold pharaoh heads trimmed the bodice. It was as if a fictional ancient Egypt had been impressed upon her white skin. Essentially, this was an embodied activity of dressing up Egyptian. Stevens's costume becomes entangled in a larger sensation, Egyptomania. And this sensation includes bottles of Egyptian sand, mummified human remains, Cleopatra costumes, travel albums, Orientalist paintings, and watercolors of antique ruins. Across the late 19th century Anglophone world, artists, historians, and collectors fabricated their own version of Egypt into Egyptomania. And Egyptomania references an attraction to all things Egyptian. And I use this term to suggest an engagement with the modern North African Middle East and the ancient Egyptian Empire. Egyptomania can also be seen as a form of American Orientalism, often cast as this fantastical, exoticized vision of a non-Western landscape. For 19th century Euro-American audiences, the ancient Egyptian past and contemporary Orient would often blend into this fantasy, and they would meld the past and the present through visuals and material culture. Many of us are probably familiar with other waves of Egyptomania, and these include Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in the 1790s and his multi-volume publication that circulated images of Egypt. Objects and architecture would then be styled after Egyptian motifs, such as the Mount Auburn Cemetery gates outside of Boston. And then there was the more modern wave with the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 that ignited Art Deco styles and decorative arts inspired by objects uncovered from the tomb, seen with the interior of the Egyptian building in Richmond, Virginia. Instead, in my dissertation, I focus on what I've termed second wave Egyptomania, which lasts roughly from 1870 to 1922, and it really embraces a multi-sensorial vision. This wave included American artists, collectors, and travelers interpreting the country amidst rising British imperialism. And the range of Egyptian-inspired objects suggests how artists and patrons experience Egyptomania through multiple senses and materials. Rather than only a type of stylistic movement, this phenomenon is tied to imperial maneuvers. And to provide some context, by the 19th century, the Egyptian ruler Ismail Pasha and his dynastic ruling family had championed modernization in Cairo and began looking to European cultural models, or urban models as well, while still under the Ottoman Empire, seen with Cairo's Opera House or the expatriate Shepherd's Hotel. Yet Egypt's economic debt, tied to European powers, also led to British occupation by 1882 under a veiled protectorate, which is a colonial occupation by another name. Egyptomania is also growing visually and performatively outside of Egypt. And today I'm focusing on a segment of my project which addresses portraits of elite women in the United States and Britain who are wearing these Egyptian-inspired dresses and jewels and interacted with antiquity through materials worn upon the body. These Anglo-Americans would don Egyptian-inspired costumes for tableaux vivants, masquerades, or fancy dress balls. The weight of Egypt upon the body would then be preserved in the form of these portraits. And I ask, how was race performed haptically when people dressed up as, quote-unquote, Egyptian? Portraits of Mary Stevens as the Egyptian queen would appear in various mediums, including a photograph by the Jose Maria Mora studio and a miniature of the socialite. Such objects invite us to consider these material dimensions of embodiment, such as the weight of fabric or clothing upon skin. And these sensorial experiences constructed imagined moments with a non-Western site or distant past. Egypt becomes this fantasized terrain and part of this larger multisensorial colonial project. And it opens questions about how Americans are interpreting Egyptomania through their senses, or how discussions about Egypt revolved around bodies. This act of physically wearing Egyptian-inspired costumes relates to a type of imagined imperialism, one performed on the body. Though the United States does not explicitly establish a traditional colony in the country, this relationship between Americans, artists, and collectors, and Egypt is a form of aesthetic, cultural, and economic imperialism. In a Puck illustration, the collector J.P. Morgan forcefully pulls in an Egyptian sarcophagus with his money magnet. This type of forceful acquisition was also reflected in Henry James's 1867 statement that Americans held the ability to, quote, deal freely with forms of civilization not their own, to pick and choose and assimilate, and in short, claim their property wherever they find it, end quote. Souvenirs, watercolors of ancient monuments, costumes, or exoticized decor enable these American viewers to visually appropriate and lay claim to ancient landscapes, ruins, and even bodies. Now, this idea of Egypt and imperialist narratives appears in a variety of objects, and one example of this cultural appropriation includes these white female sitters in the United States wearing Orientalist costumes and portraits, or interacting with antiquity through decoration on the body. Initially, Mary Stevens dresses at Cleopatra for this Delmonico's costume ball. And Stevens is also among the first Gilded Age American heiresses to cross the Atlantic and marry into the British aristocracy, and she becomes part of this network of privileged families. During this 1875 event, she led an Eastern quadrille, as it's called, at the fashionable New York restaurant, and was then photographed by the Jose Maria Mora studio. Known for his imaginary backdrops, Mora's studio became popular among the elite. As figures stepped in front of the camera wearing their sartorial creations, they were well aware of documenting themselves in costumes. And these decorative details reveal a tinge of artifice. You have a papier-mâché background, and then the peacock feather fan mounted with a pharaoh's head, which Stevens leisurely grasps. Like others, the Cleopatra attire suggests a form of embodied performance. Elizabeth Drexel Lear, a fellow socialite, described these stage masquerades and dressing up. She recounts that, quote, no one would have dreamt of anything so plebeian as modern fancy dress. We had all to be kings and queens and courtiers, end quote. At this point, wearers easily transformed themselves via fabric. Stevens then wore the garment again for photographs that coincide with the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And this album included portraits of young ladies of New York society, and it was sold to benefit the Ladies' Centennial Union. Inlaid with sterling silver by Tiffany & Company, this album is still missing, the album contained mounted portraits of women, each photographed by Mora in different costumes as, quote, one of the 16 nations of the world. Countries included Greece, Turkey, Spain, Egypt, and an all-encompassing Asia. The album itself represents the United States as a global imperial power, and it was underlined by this ease of taking on the semblance of countries, as you see here across the bodies of these women. Now, around these Orientalist objects, Americans were already deeply entrenched in racial hierarchies. And in this world of Egyptomania, visual representations and material culture became exercises of racial power. This second wave in the United States intersected with the decades of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow segregation and racial violence. And in this post-Civil War environment, elite white people like Stevens are further defining racial systems. Members of this privileged social class also identified themselves with an ancient Egyptian elite. At the same time, this group is interested in staking an imagined foundation with Egypt, found across the increasing antiquity acquisitions and emerging museum collections of ancient Egyptian art, seen here with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in the 1870s. They linked a Western canon to ancient Egypt, separate from the contemporary country. For instance, the illustration, the Caucasian types, within Josiah Clark Knott and George Robbins Glidden's 1854 book, Types of Mankind, demonstrates how ancient Egyptian wall paintings were used as visual evidence for racial hierarchies. Relying upon the stylized outlines of an Egyptian, Knott and Glidden classified each profile to demarcate a racial type. In other words, ancient Egypt's visual iconography became entangled with phrenology and biological racism to justify a particular narrative. Ancient Egypt had to be racialized as white in these representations. And in some cases, you also have artists who are whitewashing Egypt in paintings. For example, the American artist Frederick Arthur Bridgman renders Cleopatra with whitened skin. And American audiences depicted Egypt as white to further ground themselves in this racial hierarchy and this inheritance of ancient empires. With Egyptomania, elite Americans are then appropriating the aesthetics and materials of a Black civilization they conveniently cast as bygone. And Stevens is engaging in this act of racialization. She takes up this complicated figure of Cleopatra. Cast as a racially hybrid figure in this moment, the Egyptian queen was unambiguously portrayed as either white or Black in 19th century discourses of ancient history. This was an era when abolitionist writings were supporting the idea of a Black Cleopatra and relocating ancient Black civilization in Egypt. And we can place Stevenson's costume alongside sculptures of the ancient queen. At this point, colonial hierarchies were mapped onto William Wetmore Story's version on the left, or in Modia Lewis's rendition on the right. With Cleopatra depictions and white marble, audiences were either reading the royal figure as this Grecian white version versus the depiction of a sensual Eastern Egyptian type tied to Africa. And in these sartorial performances, ancient Egypt further became cast as white when relying on this Gilded Age body. And it's a process of racialization through this act of dressing up Egyptian and wearing fabric on white skin. Years later, Stevens would appear again as Cleopatra, and the original Mora photograph had been transferred onto ivory in miniature form. In 1891, the New York collector Peter Marie commissioned this likeness to join his other miniatures of society women, termed his Gallery of Beauty. Created by a range of artists, the likenesses were based on pre-existing photographs and oil portraits of these sitters. And these portraits are assembling a social group belonging to America's privileged families, these networks of Anglo-American ancestry. And painted faces reflect a racialized past through the orderly arrangement of white women to the exclusion of other races. Elite female descendants like Stevens became this racialized embodiment of New York, further mixed with the Egyptian motifs. And she's portrayed in her costume, remembered in this fantastical construction and ideal nature. It's a picturesque version of the ancient bygone past that's now appearing. And you'll also notice how her background changes into this imagined Egyptian landscape with palm trees and pyramids alongside a flowing Nile River. The miniaturist Ferdinand Paillet incorporated these exoticized Middle Eastern landscapes alongside Paget's costume. And these costumes and decorative details also enabled an American to insert her presence into the region. And it's one that's now immortalized in miniature form. As she adorns herself, she's also delving into the psychological sense of wearing the actual garments. During this period of time, the denigrated idea of touch was imbued with new psychological and emotional resonances for 19th century theorists. The term haptic, or the sense of touch, was coined during the era, with experiments on the structure of skin and handling materials. Psychologist Alexander Bain, in The Senses and the Intellect, began to explore the value of this formerly criticized feminine sense, one that embraced the outer world. And touch could provide a deeper access to the world and physically engaging with objects and the other, even from a safe, mediated distance. And from these existing photographs, we can tell the gown is mixing references to the Orient with an 1870s silhouette, an ancient headdress, culminating in this blend of forms. motifs from Egypt physically wrapped around her corseted frame. We can imagine Stevens gathering up her heavy train, rearranging her headdress, and playfully lifting her hand with the fan to adopt the semblance of the other. She's harnessing the sense of touch to register and perhaps understand her American colonial position through this intimate bodily experience. And this idea of physically dressing up continues past the costume balls. For example, American jewelry firms are creating pieces involving Egyptian-inspired designs. The New York firm Marcus & Company fabricated a large white opal brooch with abstracted Egyptian figurines, lotus flowers, ibises, and motifs pulled from ancient temples. Worn on the body and pinned to the wearer, these jewelry pieces offered clients a reimagination of Egyptian material, ones that were being unearthed in excavations and displayed at grand expositions. In a sense, it was a way to further create a bodily tie between the United States and claim a foreign or othered landscape. And I placed these costumes and portraits in conversation with other Egyptian revival decorative art and interiors when thinking about the sensorial side. Experiencing Egypt through the body continued with furniture and decorative art created in the United States. Take, for example, the 1870s chairs by the New York firm Pottier & Stymus, likely part of a larger suite. The French background of these designers also perhaps account for some of the French Egyptomania motifs. And on the arms of these chairs are fantastical brass mounts of ancient Egyptian heads with this Nemes headdress. These cast metal mounts would reappear also in other revival furniture. The Aubusson upholstery with this composite Egyptian landscape includes columns, a sphinx, and palmettes. And it's an Egyptian landscape, one that was fictionalized and distilled into motifs legible for a Gilded Age audience. Though the owners of this furniture suite remain unknown, we can perhaps imagine the clients interacting with the sensorial sides of the chair. You would have to be leaning back into the Egyptian landscape or physically touching those Egyptian-inspired heads. And it's a way the foreign landscape is becoming transplanted into an American interior. And these decorative details become a reinterpretation, even willful reimagination about the country. And it's about putting these portraits and decorative arts together and invite us to consider how these objects can intentionally skew the relationship between audiences and this imaginary exotic. 19th century encounters with Egypt were already described in very corporeal-driven moments. And in 1875, while aboard a Nile River cruise, the Boston collector Isabel Stewart Gardner wrote down impressions in her travel album that described the fragrances across the Nile and how her thoughts went to Cleopatra. American collectors like Gardner traveled to this region of the Orient as a form of sensuous escapism, and they relied on immersive moments and cross-cultural encounters with Egyptian material, which she then records in her album in watercolors. The sensorial experience of Egypt was so overwhelming for Gardner, she grabbed handfuls of sand and placed them into engraved bottles to remember her experience with this past and present Egypt. And Gardner's experiencing an intimate encounter that leads to this acquired sand. And as part of the Egyptian landscape, her body had actually physically touched. In a different type of tactile encounter, Stevens in her Egyptomania costume or an American client with their furniture relied on the body to create this fictional contact with the country. These portraits and decor evoke a sensorial experience, a haptic moment between white skin and decorative pharaoh heads or brass mounts. Colonial power and sights became embodied through the experience of touch. Encased in these bracelets and gold pharaohs, Stevens could experience the revelatory nature of her skin, her imperial position perhaps impressing itself upon her body. And the senses, spurred by this range of objects, offered this escape into a fantasy of Egypt, and a means for Americans to conceptualize the bodies of others as well as their own. In her studies on the cultural history of the senses, Constance Clason discusses how touch creates a connection between subject and object. Haptic moments could link possessor and decorative, leading this type of sensuous interaction. And in a way, Stevens performs a type of bodily convergence, adopting an ancient bygone past as her own. Costumes captured in portraits mirror the synthesis of cultures. And it's a sartorial activity that offered the ability to at once affirm and retreat into a fantastical version. As described by Amelia Mueller on these costume balls, guests experienced, quote, a fantasy of two bodies simultaneously, self and other together, the two in one, end quote. While dressing up as this historical figure, Stevens temporarily performed as other, while still solidifying her own whiteness. This was a harmony between elite white patron and Egyptian artifice, and one that existed in these New York spaces, and these rooms would shield out elements of an outside modern Egypt. And years later, this sensorial Egyptian design would continue in New York. In 1913, Louis Comfort Tiffany hosted an Egyptian fete in the Tiffany Studios to celebrate his birthday. Calling upon the advice of Joseph Lyndon Smith, an artist often painting unearthed artifacts, Tiffany crafted this performative vision of Egypt. Guests were instructed to come in costume, and the event included various American artists, performers, and prominent New Yorkers dressed in Egyptian-inspired attire. The large gallery was decorated in Orientalist-style rugs and divans, including professional actors as Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Ruth St. Denis dancing, and strains of Verdi's Aida heard throughout the rooms. Guests were then photographed, and you see Tiffany here, in different Egyptian costumes, and performances also involved antique-related possessions. His daughter, Julia Tiffany, would wear this peacock headdress for the pageantry, a tired Egyptian-inspired tunic and jewelry. And this accessory includes brilliant peacock feathers and the bird head across the top, along with beads and sequins down the sides. We can still ask, how would these bird feathers and beads ignite the senses and become activated when Julia moved? And in what way do these exoticized materials further construct a fictional Egypt, one that impressed itself upon white skin? Thank you.